we really quick get a show of hands for folks who might be in DFIR? Anybody? Okay, good. So some folks with that experience, some without. This is a little bit of a crash course in a couple of forensic artifacts, but also we're going into the background behind why we think it's really important for security teams to know a little bit about these artifacts. So Partha and I are from Aon/Strauss Friedberg. We do IR consulting, anything from ransomwares, business email compromise, to like traditional forensics, supporting litigation matters, imaging your phone, getting the messages off of it, all of that kind of stuff across the board. And we're excited to speak with you today.
All right, thanks, Carly. Let's start with a quick introduction to our talk. So let's say today you had a ransomware incident within your organization. What do? You need to investigate what happened, figure out how the threat actor got in, what did they do, how did they achieve their objectives. To do all of that, you need access to data and visibility. As Matt said yesterday, it all starts with telemetry, right? So what type of telemetry? You need access to user activity, file activity, process activity, network and system activity. That kind of forms your base telemetry. But imagine collecting all of this information across your network. It's a lot of data. It's good data, but it's a lot of data. And to review that data is going to take a long time. So how can you shorten that time? Through enriching that data using threat intelligence or detection engineering, stuff like that. Now, that's where kind of EDRs can come in, where EDRs are these really awesome products that track all the telemetry, and it can be used by IR examiners, security consultants, stuff like that. So you can use this data collected by the EDR to investigate what happened, all the way from initial access to how the threat actor achieved their objectives. But that's just the detection part of EDRs. There's also a response component where EDRs can be used to contain, quarantine systems, malware, things like that. Now, Carly and I have been doing this for, 7-8 years now, and we've seen how our clients utilize EDRs. And we see good things about it. We see challenges as well. EDRs have really helped our clients in terms of detection, prevention of incidents, and containment, all of that stuff that I just covered. But there's also challenges with this tool, right? So specifically with detections, deployment, OS compatibility, all of that. Now, when you have these challenges, there's one very big issue that kind of comes up, which is gaps in visibility. If you don't have the telemetry flowing in, you're going to have that gap. So how do you fill that gap? You can use digital forensic artifacts to kind of cover up any gaps in visibility and kind of still get the full picture of what happened. So that's our talk for today. That's the agenda. Carly is going to start off by talking about the current landscape of EDRs, some of the challenges that we have seen as part of our day-to-day, and both of us will then get into the forensics bit and explain how we can use forensics to fill those gaps.
Thanks, Partha. So starting to talk about the EDR landscape, I assume most of us are familiar with what an EDR tool is, and the main functionality of EDRs is sort of fourfold along these lines: to collect your data, whether that's process activity, network telemetry, file user activity, alert on that using the pre-built rules that are in the EDR, as well as anything custom that you've added to it, block those things so it can act as an extra set of hands within your security organization, and then finally investigate things when you're in an incident response scenario and you need to look back on what happened and how that occurred. EDR is really helpful when it comes to baselining your environment, knowing what's normal so you can then spot what's anomalous, finding rogue applications your users are using. Are there domains or sites they're accessing that they shouldn't be? Proactive threat hunts as well, finding things, before your EDR alerts on them. Maybe it's new attack patterns that aren't yet baked into those detections in the EDR, or whether it's custom behavioral patterns that your targeting threat actors that are in your industry might be using that might not be in there. And finally, incident response as well, both the containment side and making sure your threat actor is out, and then determining how it happened and ensuring that they don't get back in the future. We've seen a lot of wins over our time as incident responders that our clients have had from EDR, everywhere from preventing ransomware execution and basically saving the network in those terms, to detecting and blocking remote management software, which threat actors love to use these days. They might change the file name or something like that, but the EDR will still detect those kinds of tools. We've had customers where EDR will detect when a threat actor re-enters the network after they think they have gone through containment, and the threat actor is able to break containment, get back in, but EDR has detected that super quickly because of these custom IOCs that were built in from profiling of that known threat actor. So that's the great thing about EDR. It's very helpful. We should all use it. But I'm going to talk a little bit now about some of the challenges we see and where your visibility can be limited, even if you have an EDR tool in place. So when it comes to deployment, this is one of the main areas where we see gaps in visibility when it comes to EDR. You might have critical systems that you don't have that deployed on. You don't want your EDR to conflict with these. You can't afford the downtime on whatever services are running on those systems. It's something that we see critically and often in our cases, but unfortunately, those systems are often, have some of the most important data that threat actors are after. There are often unsupported operating systems that might be too old, or appliances that don't support EDR. ESXi comes to mind. We often see threat actors attacking that, trying to get to that hypervisor that's hosting all these guest systems, but there's no EDR running on that hypervisor. Temporary systems as well. This is a little bit of a thorn in my side because I've had so many engagements where we deal with threat actors targeting temporary systems because you haven't hardened it as much as your other systems. Maybe you don't want to, spend an EDR license on that system because it'll only be up for a temporary period of time. But we all know sometimes those systems can get lost and be up for much longer than you anticipate. Package management, if you have issues, especially across operating systems, maybe you've got it all figured out for Windows and Mac, but you're lacking this on your Linux systems, that kind of thing can lead to gaps in deployment. And then finally, even if you had your EDR deployed on 100% of your systems, those sensors can go unresponsive. Things can happen where they're not reporting back into the console. So all of these things can lead to major gaps in visibility, and organizations often don't have great ways of tracking these gaps as well. Staffing and management is another item here. So often we see teams that put a lot of trust in their tooling. And we've already heard a little bit about that and how, your tools will catch everything and relying on these alerts. We've seen in our casework that there are a number of alerts that may be classified as low severity or something like that on their own. But when we see them, we know that they're an indicator of something to come or something that has already happened that's much more serious and a much more broad attack. Also, when it comes to EDRs, they're collecting so much telemetry. It's a large volume of data, and that has, technical issues as well as the people issues where you have to think about how to query this. How do you make that work for you? I've had, customers with a year's worth of EDR telemetry, which is great in theory, but in practice, the query speeds were so low that it was basically unusable, and so we've run into those issues as well. Misconfiguration too. I think most people who use any security tools are familiar with how finicky it is to configure these sometimes. You might have broad exclusion lists. You might configure it to only alert when you think it's actually going to be blocking things for you. You might not have MFA on that console, and that can lead to dire consequences. Or you might have a sensor that's in bypass mode because you were troubleshooting and forget to switch that back over. If that's not enough, threat actors can also interfere with your EDR tooling. Unfortunately, we have seen this from time to time. We've seen threat actors target exclusion paths where you don't want your EDR to scan it because of those conflict issues that we mentioned before briefly. But threat actors know the common places for that. They might also, know more information about your organization from other escapades that they've been doing to know where those exclusion paths are and put their malware in those directories. They might boot your systems in safe mode or fully uninstall your EDR. And if you trust our QR code, we have some blog posts on ways that can be done outside the scope of this talk. And finally, console access. We've seen it where threat actors have gotten into EDR consoles. And in some cases, depending on privileges, that can be keys to the kingdom. They basically have control over deploying, their own malware all across your network, doing recon across your network. It can be really messy if threat actors get in there, but it definitely does happen. So all of that to say, those are some of the gaps that can be caused by EDR tools. Even if you have, great deployment, sometimes you have less than great deployment. All of these things can cause gaps in visibility, and that's where we see a strong need to keep, those forensic skills up and go back to disk artifacts. And Partha will talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, thanks, Carly. So let's say you take data from the types of data that EDR collects, types of data that forensic artifacts collects, and put them into a Venn diagram. You'll see that there is an intersection where both EDR and forensic artifacts can pull similar types of data. And you can use that data to fill those gaps, as Carly mentioned, or you can use that to cross-validate the findings in your investigation. Now, there is data that only forensic artifacts can get you, and there are a few categories here, right? So in terms of EDRs and collecting data, EDRs can collect a lot of data, but the problem with collecting a lot of data is data retention. So you typically have to cap it for cost reasons. But forensic artifacts, a lot of them have years worth of retention. If you look at forensic artifacts like Syscache, or we'll actually cover a few, those artifacts track a lot of information going back many, many years. Also, threat actors, typically use RDP or other methods to gain access to systems and start engaging with the system, have interactive activity on these systems. That type of information is typically not tracked by an EDR. You don't know the order in which the folders were opened or the files that were opened. But with forensics, you can kind of pull all of that information. Also, you can recover any files using forensic carving methodologies. A big caveat there, it's not always possible. It really does depend on the size of the file and things like that, but you can still use forensic methods to kind of get some of the files out. And finally, and most importantly, is the application-specific activity, right? So what do I mean by that? Let's say a threat actor is using PuTTY to connect to their command and control. An EDR can tell you they use PuTTY, they connected to this particular IP address, but it can't tell you the metadata associated with that particular connection, right? So that's the type of stuff that will be very useful in profiling threat actors. That's the level of granular information that you can use to understand your threat actor. Now, forensics is a very vast field, and we have, I think, 15 or 13 minutes left. So we're going to be covering Windows forensic artifacts in this talk. We're going to be skimming through some of those, but just understand that we're not going to be able to cover every single thing because it's a pretty big field.
For those at the back who couldn't see, that was just the tip of the iceberg. So starting out with process activity, this is our whirlwind through a couple of artifacts. It's very important in any incident response or any security processes to know what executables are on your system, have been on your system, are running on there. So Amcache is a registry hive that might be helpful, often has metadata about different executables that exist on the system. Hash value, that can especially be helpful in identifying things that have been deleted, whether by the threat actor or other processes. Prefetch is another artifact, not enabled by default on Windows Server, but it is on desktop. It can give you the full path of those files, and including information about files or volumes that were accessed within the first few seconds of that application starting up, which can often be helpful. Syscache as well, Partha briefly mentioned this, but syscache contains hashes of executables that have run. Oftentimes, this goes back several years. And another nice thing about syscache is that it contains parent-child relationships. So that can give you a little bit of sort of process tree information similar to what you might get through an EDR, but often with much greater retention. There's so many more. Matt mentioned this yesterday as well. There's probably, dozens of artifacts that can show you what was running on your system. All of this can be used to supplement your process activity through EDR and can show you many other details about those files as well. When it comes to file and folder activity, a lot of these are file system artifacts, which are great, a lot of them very basic. The master file table, of course, very important in NTFS volumes, contains all the metadata about your files. If your files are small enough, they might be resident within that MFT. You might be able to get that entire file back, information about the owner, privileges, things like that for each file that exists on disk. USN Journal is a little bit more historical. This tracks what has been modified, created, deleted on the file system. Retention can definitely vary, but it can be very useful to tell what was deleted. You can get those deletion timestamps and things like that, which can otherwise be a little bit hard to track, especially if it goes back in time. The $I30 attribute is an attribute also for NTFS file systems. For files and directories on disk. What is interesting here that we've used in the past on our investigations is you might be able to see what files previously existed within a directory by reading that I30 attribute for a directory on disk. And volume shadow copies store backups of files. We've had a lot of wins here going into volume shadow copies to recover logs, or in some cases even full exfiltrated archives that a threat actor took off the system and deleted, but we were able to get that back from volume shadow copies and tell our customers exactly what was in those archives that were exfiltrated from their systems.
Thanks, Carly. So it's quite common, again, as I said, with the forensic differentiator slide, for threat actors to use RDP to gain access to systems, right? And most commonly, they're going to browse through files, folders, figure out, where the sensitive files are, what to exfiltrate, stuff like that. So when they do that, how do you track that information? There's an artifact called Shellbags in Windows. It's basically a registry object that tracks display of folders on a Windows system. So this is a user-specific artifact. So you can find this information in the ntuser.dat and the userclass.dat registry hives. In terms of what you can recover, you can get the full path, the user that performed the traversal, and the timestamp of when exactly it happened. It's actually a very interesting artifact, especially during IR, because you can timeline how the threat actor browsed through a certain folder, what they were after. It's a very, very interesting artifact. But my favorite artifact is the RDP bitmap cache. So again, if a threat actor utilizes RDP, and the persistent bitmap caching is enabled, Windows kind of tracks these changes that happen in RDP and saves them in the bitmap cache. So you can use open source parsers like the one that I've listed on the slide, and that'll give you something like this, which is completely unorganized, they're not in order, and it's actually the examiner's job to stitch it back together to make sense of what might have happened in an RDP session. On the top right, that's something that we got from a real case where we saw a threat actor zipping up sensitive files into a file called done.rar. We'll cover more on this artifact in a little bit, but it's a very, very interesting artifact. So next thing is network and system activity. In a lot of cases, we, as part of scoping, we ask our clients, hey, do you have firewall logs? Do you have this and that? Typically, I wouldn't say typically, there are some customers who don't have centralization enabled whatsoever, right? So they have that big gap in network visibility. When that happens, figuring out who got access to what systems, ingress, egress, data exfiltration, all of that becomes an issue. So in terms of ingress, you can use an artifact on Windows systems called user access log or the SUM database. This artifact, tracks a lot of data, but I think for our purposes, in terms of you can get who accessed a particular system, which user, from where, at what time, and that retention goes back many years. So it's a very helpful artifact. It really has saved us, especially when there is no telemetry and when Windows event logs have rolled over completely. Egress, you can track it through the MRU and jump list. Both, again, are user-specific artifacts. You can get the IP address, the time, and the user that initiated that egress connection. In terms of data exfiltration, obviously, we want to rely on firewall logs to determine the number of bytes that were sent out and stuff like that. But when you don't have that, SRUM is a really good artifact to use to determine that data, right? So here, SRUM is basically an ESC database that tracks a lot of information, network usage, program execution, all of that. There's a specific table in there called the application resource usage table that tracks the user, the program that was executed, and the bytes in, bytes out per application. How is this used? So let's say a threat actor utilizes WinSCP to transfer data. We can tell exactly when a threat actor executes that program and how many bytes were sent out using that program. It doesn't track any IP addresses, but it's still a very helpful artifact to have. Now, we covered all of this. We didn't even talk about event logs because they deserve their own category. I'm not going to go too deep into event logs, but the gist of it, like I'll explain it through a scenario here. Common initial access vector, user connects to a machine, they open a malicious document, PowerShell gets launched, malware runs, persistence is established. All steps 1 through 5 can be tracked in Windows event logs, as long as you have configured it properly, right? So internally in our company, we have a cheat sheet, and we have kind of automated this process where this has about 50 event IDs across multiple event logs. This really helps us kind of get to answers very quickly, and we have a tool that does that in like 5 seconds. But it can give you a lot of information about initial access, lateral movement, program executions, and all of that. So these are our most important event IDs that we review, at least in the first pass. So let's get to a case study, and I'll maybe zoom through this because we have 5 minutes. So just a quick background. We were engaged by our client to investigate these 2 devices where our client observed advanced IP scanner. So we're like, okay, cool, we'll take it and we'll review these 2 systems. And we started asking them questions about, what type of visibility do they have in the network? And unfortunately, the organization had just started rolling out EDR and only had about 3% coverage. No visibility with the network side either. So huge gaps in visibility all over, right? So we used forensics and we identified a lot of bad using all the forensic artifacts that I just mentioned, reconnaissance, credential dumping, command and control malware on both these 2 laptops. Our forensic investigation basically led us to a production Confluent server that was compromised. Now, all these indicators of compromise that we collected throughout this incident matched an actor called Profit Spider. I'm not sure if folks have heard about this actor, but this actor was pretty sophisticated. They had good expertise in kind of scaling their attacks against Windows and Linux systems. So the question that our team had was, okay, is it just these 3 systems or is it more? So that's where we collected forensic artifacts because remember, there's no telemetry at all. There's no network logs. So we used forensic artifacts, collected all that across all these thousands of systems, and started processing them for execution evidence, interactive activity evidence, lateral movement. That expanded the scope from 2 systems to 30 systems, right, that were compromised. And just to kind of give you some snippets, these were some of the things that we were able to get from the RDP bitmap cache. This is a threat actor kind of creating a volume shadow copy, doing the NTDS.dit exfiltration. We can even see their password that they entered into the 7-zip prompt there. So it's this type of stuff that EDR doesn't track. Your telemetry can't track, right? So there is definitely value in kind of getting these artifacts, adding that extra layer of granularity to your investigations. We also found evidence of exfiltration using WinSCP. We got the command and control IP addresses, the files that were exfiltrated, and all of that. Now, what started out with two systems, with just forensics, the attack map looked like this in the end, right? So that's how helpful forensics can be. So how did we kind of scale all of that? We were able to scale our investigation using a tool called Velociraptor. Some of you may have heard of it. Matt mentioned it yesterday. Very, very useful tool. It's an agent-based DFIR tool. Basically, you can query and parse these artifacts through something called hunts. You can either retrieve these results in bulk across your organization or per system.
So a few of the takeaways from this talk in our last 1 minute, 56 seconds. So really the whole point is conduct your investigations holistically. Make sure you're looking at all the data sources available. You know, EDR is great, security tools are great, but you can't rely on just that because of all the gaps that we described. Configure your tools, make sure you have the most visibility that you can get out of them, and then pair that with, you know, forensic artifacts, network logging, all of these other things to give you the historical insight that you need when you're investigating an incident going back in time. And quick special thanks to a lot of our team members who helped out. Sankara helped come up with the idea for our talk, but Andre, Ann, Haley, Zach, John, Bashar, we have a wonderful team. Always want to thank them. And you can follow us on Twitter. You can check out our blog if you're interested in more content from our team. Thanks all.
Also, thank you to Lima Charlie for organizing this. So, thank you.
Hi, I've got a question. So let's assume I have Aon insurance and I have a small team. I can't afford a DF person. What are 3 things I can do to make your life easier when I get popped? And I've got to call you guys to come in.
Repeat that one more time.
I'm a small team. I don't have the budget to hire a DF person.
Yeah.
I can have IR.
Yeah.
I've got Aon insurance.
Okay.
And if I get popped, you guys will come in.
Okay.
What are 3 things I can do to make your life easier if that happens?
Collect all the data that you can. So telemetry is going to be very important.
Can you give like 3 specific data sources I can tell my team today to collect?
Okay. So device telemetry is going to be one. Collect that. Network perimeter. That's the second thing. And any other additional artifacts that you can think of, Carly?
Broad categories. I would say in terms of those, make sure your retention is good. Like we said, the retention is going to make a big difference. Oftentimes, we have clients who don't realize a breach has happened for several weeks, or it's something more serious than you thought it was, and so the earlier stuff is gone. I would say make sure your retention is good as it can be with the resources that you have.
Yep. But we can meet offline as well and just have a brainstorming session, I guess.